Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is Carole Engle Avriett. She is a best-selling author, and her new book is Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalions. We just want to let you know that Carole is appreciative of both theaters of operation in World War II. Her first book on World War II was entitled Coffin Corner Boys, One Bomber, 10 Men, and Their Harrowing Escape from Nazi-Occupied France, which I also highly encourage. And Carole, thanks very much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. It is a delight to be with you.
So, Carole, before there could be Marine Raiders, the Raider units, these battalions had to exist, which they did not when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So how and why were these Raider battalions created?
Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Marine Corps, the higher-ups, the leadership realized that there would be some different dynamics in fighting a war in the Pacific on these islands. And to meet some of those challenges through a series of events, they decided to create these small commando style units. And President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was much in favor of it. His friend across the pond, Churchill, had at that time some wonderful British commandos. So again, through a series of events, the Marine Raiders were born. The 1st Raider Battalion on February 16th, 1942. 2nd Raider Battalion was stood up 3 days later on February 19th, 1942. And then 3rd and 4th Raider Battalion came into existence later in the summer and early fall of 42.
And who were they looking for within the Marine Corps population as it existed to be a Raider? What set the person apart that they wanted as opposed to the rest of the Marines?
Well, first of all, one of the things that you had to do, you actually had to volunteer to be considered to be a Raider. And then you sort of went through a series of interviews and some other physical different tests and all. But those interviews were really critical. And one of the things that the leaders of the battalions, the Marine Raider battalions, said, they were not looking for young men who had sort of a false bravado, maybe sort of a pseudo, they even called it pseudo patriotism, really. They were looking for solid, confident young men who could easily fit into the physicality that would be required. They looked for a lot of farm boys, very strong with that kind of outdoor physicality background, physical background. A lot of football players joined the Raiders. One of the men that I interviewed was a lumberjack before he joined the Raiders. So strong, good character, even-keeled, not anyone that was looking for adventure in the wrong kind of way. So it was really interesting, and not all who volunteered were chosen. One of the ones that I write about in the book was just 17 years old, 3 months into his 17th year.
Wow.
And he was in a group of 11 others that were being interviewed at the same time he was. He was the only one out of those 11 that was chosen. So it didn't necessarily depend on age either. It's just some qualities, some solid, strong qualities of mind and body that they were looking for.
And it's very vivid in the book, and it's such a well-written book in addition to the story that's told about how these commanders went about the interview process. And you talk a lot about Merritt Edson and Evans Carlson, the first two commanders of the 1st and the 2nd Battalion, and how their personalities kind of became the personality for these entire units. And one of them, I believe, was in there when Edson he was asking him about his marksmanship, and he's asking him about some other things. And then just out of the blue, he says, could you come up behind the enemy and slit his throat without a second thought? I mean, that's a pretty direct way of screening for whether people are ready for this role or not.
It really is, Greg. And can you imagine, you're going along and you're just, most of these young men, these boys, had really never even left their county, many of them. And so here they are, and they are being interviewed by someone who already had a tremendous reputation within the Marine Corps. Both Merritt Edson and Evans Carlson did. And evidently, Edson, and I talk about this in the book, they said his stare could wither a person. He had just one of those solid, no nonsense, no sort of expressionless stare. And so he's talking along, and this is to Lee Manier, that's the young man you're talking about, referring to in the book. You can imagine, just put yourself in his shoes, and you're sort of talking about things in general. And then without skipping a beat, without changing his tone, and certainly without removing his stare from the young man, he simply says, do you think you could slip up behind someone, behind a Japanese, and slit his throat? And you would just pause. But every leader said, without exception, they watched carefully how a young man reacted to that question. Because as I said before, they were not looking for someone that had false bravado. They were looking for someone who did some thinking before answering that question. And it was a very interesting interview process. But as a result, they filled their 4 battalions with some very, very outstanding young men.
They most certainly did. The type of fighting they had to do was just incredible. But one of the things that fascinated me as soon as they got to combat, Carole, was no matter what these raiders encountered, they were ready for it because of the marvelous training that they received. What did that training include? So they came to expect pretty much everything the Japanese tried to throw at them.
Well, Greg, you raise a very good point of something we have not brought up. Prior to World War II, so many of the Marines had been to China, had been based in China during those late 30s. Many of them had seen combat in Nicaragua, but of special value was that time that they had spent in China, because both Edson and Carlson were very familiar through their contacts with the Chinese army of the tactics that the Japanese soldiers used during combat. So as a result, when we were drawn into the war, when we declared war, then they were able to teach these young men what they knew that our young men were going to be faced with in fighting these incredibly skilled and Japanese troops who already were seasoned. And one of those things was that they did this thing, the banzai attacks. And that would just be simply wave after wave after wave of Japanese soldiers that literally just committed themselves to being killed in order that the wave behind them would be able to make further progress. Just fighting unlike anything that any of our troops had ever seen. Another thing is that the Japanese used nighttime as a weapon. They used the jungle itself as a weapon. And this was a kind of fighting that, had not Edson and Carlson both already witnessed some of this, they would not have been able to train their own battalions to meet this kind of warfare. The code of Bushido, you've probably heard of that before. The Japanese would fight to the last man if they had to. They would fight to death rather than surrender at any cost. And there again, that was a different kind of thing. Even, in the European theater, when the Germans realized, of course it took a while, but when they realized they were defeated, they surrendered by the hundreds of thousands, at one time 300,000. This was different. The Japanese were different in this way. And it required a different kind of mindset and a different kind of training for these young men.
Absolutely fascinating. Carole, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be right back with much more of the story. We're going to talk about the Raiders in combat on Guadalcanal and beyond, and we'll do so in just a moment here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined today by Carole Engle Avriett. She is the author, most recently, of Marine Raiders, The True Story of the legendary World War II battalions. And Carole, much of the raiders' work was focused on Guadalcanal or islands nearby. Explain briefly the strategic importance of that island and why the raiders were called in there to play such critical roles.
I suspect, and as I did my research, it confirmed that at the very start, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, December 7th, 1941, and as the new year, 1942, rolled in, I suspect that the very higher ups in the military began to look at the South Pacific, look at the Pacific as a whole, to try to decide exactly where we would make our first attempt at a ground landing. Already the Japanese, just days after Pearl Harbor, began an absolute spread. I mean, Guam fell, Wake fell. They were just seemingly all over everywhere. And I suspect that when whoever it was that finally decided that Guadalcanal would be the very first place that we would invade, just like Normandy in Europe was for the continent, was the first place, Guadalcanal was the first place. And I suspect that there was more than one military leader who looked up and said, where the Sam Hill is that? And probably started scrambling for maps, because the Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands was a place that you just didn't get there by accident. I mean, it was in the middle of nowhere. One of the little pieces of trivia that I'm just going to throw out to you: the Pacific Ocean has 63 million square miles of water. And if you can imagine, the Solomon Islands are like a string of pearls that are sort of strung down there in the South Pacific. And so it took weeks, just to even get there. And the island fighting was so different from anything that we had ever committed ourselves to in the past, our military had. So there was just a different mindset. It required amphibious landings. The Marine Corps and the Marine Raiders wound up doing things that were seemingly almost unimaginable in terms of the fighting. Our guys learned very quickly that they were fighting not only a two-legged enemy, but they were fighting a jungle enemy as well. The jungle just took such a toll on their bodies as they were trying to fight in that environment. So you had then the invasion of Guadalcanal, August 7th, 1942, exactly 8 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that was the beginning of the war in the Pacific. It was quite a fierce fight. And the reason that Guadalcanal became so important was because Guadalcanal had one thing that we desperately wanted to take away from the Japanese and utilize for ourselves, and that was an airstrip. And that airstrip, that airfield, was renamed by our guys Henderson Field. It was actually named after one of the pilots, Marine pilots, in fact, at Midway. He was one of the first killed in that decisive naval battle. And so we had to have Henderson Field, because if the Japanese held it, then they could fly all over, and Australia then was in play for the Japanese. So that was our goal. It took us about 6 months to secure that airstrip and to completely run the Japanese off Guadalcanal. And then we began what they called the island ladder, going from one island to the next, getting closer and closer to the main island of Japan.
Let's dive in now and talk about some of the action here, because the first Raider Battalion saw action at Tulagi, if I'm saying that correctly, right next to Guadalcanal. They succeeded in their mission, but the fighting, as you just mentioned, very, very intense, as it was throughout Guadalcanal and beyond. They also learned as a result, though, because of that intense fighting, how good they were. It sounds like they already knew because of the training, but they really learned it there. And how much did that help them mentally for the difficult fighting that lay ahead?
Oh, I think tremendously. You mentioned Tulagi. On August 7th, that the day of the invasion, the D-Day, for Guadalcanal and the beginning, literally the beginning of the ground war in the Pacific. General Vandegrift took his primary Marine division and landed on Guadalcanal. To Tulagi, which was just a little tiny island just across the channel from Guadalcanal, he sent Edson and Edson's 1st Raider Battalion. There were some paratrooper Marines that were under Edson's purview. There was also a unit or two of other other Marine units. I'm sorry, the division was with Vandegrift. But Edson primarily had his 1st Marine Raiders. And the reason that Vandegrift gave Edson that assignment was because Vandegrift knew how well trained these 1st Raiders were. And he knew that they were ready to fight. He wasn't entirely certain about some of the new ones that he had had to pull in so quickly to the main Marine division. But he knew that the Raiders were ready. And he also knew that Tulagi was where the Japanese had placed their special forces. In other words, their very best of the best fighters had been housed on Tulagi. And I always say Tulagi actually was where the British had their protectorate. They had government buildings there. They had a golf course there and a prison. And I suspect that the Japanese probably housed their best troops, their special forces, as a little bonus to give them that golf course, because when the Raiders liberated Tulagi, it's the funniest scene in the book. One of the XO for 1st Raiders said, and we liberated several golf club bags and a few golf clubs. But when they first landed, they had surprised the Japanese, both on Guadalcanal and on Tulagi. But that didn't last long. And when these special forces on Tulagi realized that they were being invaded, I mean, they immediately came to task. And so for a very intense couple of days, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion met the Japanese. But the Japanese learned one thing about these Raiders. They learned that they could fight too. And one of the officers said that probably the Japanese thought that they were not going to be facing crack troops, but they learned very quickly that the Raiders had been trained to a knife-edge preparedness, just like they were.
Carole, let me pause you right there. Still to come on Veterans Chronicles, Carole and I will be discussing the Marine Raiders at Bloody Ridge, as well as the Long Patrol, and much more. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. You're listening to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Honored to be joined today by Carole Engle Avriett. She's a military historian, author of 7 books, 3 on military history. The latest is Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalions. And we were just talking about the fighting on Tulagi and the really elite troops versus elite troops. And you follow a number of veterans throughout this story, a number of which who you met personally. But there's one quote in here from someone who actually died on Tulagi that just, I think, crystallizes the dedication of these Raiders. And he's Private First Class Eddie Ahrens. And here's how you write it. Bodies were strewn everywhere, some piled on top of one another. Lee, meaning Lee Manier, walked around. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Then he saw Captain Lou Walt peering into a foxhole where Private First Class Eddie Ahrens lay quietly with his eyes closed. The 5'7" private was covered in blood and was dying. A dead Japanese officer lay flung across his legs. A Japanese sergeant lay beside him. Crumpled around his foxhole were 13 other Japanese bodies. Eddie had been hit twice in the chest with bullets and speared several times with bayonets. As Captain Walt gathered the young men into his arms, the private whispered, "Captain, they tried to come over me last night, but I don't think they made it. Guess they didn't know I was a Marine Raider." I mean, you talk about absolutely giving every last ounce of devotion. And it's true of all the guys you mentioned in this book, but I thought that quote was just really powerful.
It really is. And I have to tell you that is one of the favorite stories, oral stories, that the young Marine Raiders today enjoy listening to. It's quite it's poignant, but it's also one of the most inspiring stories, I think. And it does give you the sense and the feeling of what these Raiders were all about, because I think to a man. That's probably how they all felt, internally. They were there. A raider kills or is killed, and that was their mentality.
No doubt, no doubt. You also discuss the 2nd Raider Battalion at Makin Atoll, and we learn more about one of the recurring veterans in this story, who's known as Mudhole Merrill. This Makin Atoll is barely a dot in the ocean, but it was seen as a way to possibly lure more Japanese troops away from Guadalcanal, if I remember correctly. So briefly discuss the fighting there and what we learned about the raiders there.
And let me just insert right here, quickly. The structure that I chose for the book was to show all 4 battalions through the eyesight of one member from each battalion. So you have a person from a raider from 1st Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 3rd, and 4th. The structure is different from any book that's been written on Marine raiders. And in 2nd Battalion, the young man that you've mentioned, Kenny Mudhole Merrill. Actually, Jimmy Roosevelt named him one time because he nearly stumbled over him while Mudhole was taking a drink out of literally a mud hole, and that was how his name came. He was Mudhole Merrill till the day he died. Yes, Macon was, they actually thought it was more fortified, that it had more Japanese soldiers on it than it actually did. But it was one that they wanted to make sure that they controlled so that the spread of the Japanese soldiers could not continue on. Macon was just a ribbon, a coral ribbon, really, not very wide. And they landed there, and from the get-go, from the time that they exited the submarines at night and were going to use these rubber boats to get in, the submarines surfaced in the middle of one of the worst squalls of the century. And you're talking about, 15, 20-foot seas. So the raiders are scrambling around trying to get their rubber boats inflated, get engines on, get themselves into the water. And they had to, go with the crest of the submarine coming up and coming down. So it was pandemonium from the very time that they left the subs and got to the shore. And Mudhole Merrill, 3 of the men I was able to interview personally, and Mudhole was one of them. He was still living when I started writing this book. And I'm telling you, what a character. He absolutely, in fact, I was with his daughter and son-in-law just this past weekend, and we just laughed the whole weekend over Mudhole Merrill's stories. And his daughter reminded me that you can say Kenny Merrill to somebody in the Marine Raiders and they won't know who you're talking about. But if you say Mudhole, you know. But he landed on that little Macon Island, and I'll tell you, that was his first real taste of combat. And we have those stories. They're just unbelievable, some of the things that happened. He wound up machine gunning down a Japanese that was headed toward him on a bicycle. And for some reason, the bicycle just kept, and the Japanese just kept coming, and Mudhole kept shooting and shooting. And finally, the Japanese fell off, and he had shot him. But the bicycle kept coming. When Mudhole told me that story, I'm telling you, you didn't know whether to laugh or cry, because he said, finally, the thing did keel over, the bicycle. And he said, Carole, I realized I was trembling like a leaf. He said, I've never been so scared in my life. And of course, when he got back to his foxhole and all his buddies realized that he was safe, they said, Mudhole, for heaven's sakes, you just killed yourself a bicycle. I mean, it was just the funniest story. But it shows you how in war you have these split-second moments of sheer stark terror. And then the next second, his buddies in the foxhole were just laughing uncontrollably because of the incident that had happened. So Macon was something else. Getting off Macon was harder than getting on Macon. And it actually is a story that still today is filled with a lot of controversy and a lot of still some unknowns. Long story short, and your listeners will just have to read it through to see what all happened. But to cut to the chase, evidently a number of young men were left stranded on Macon. They thought they had gotten all of them. The two submarines went back to Pearl. They had to go silent, so they really couldn't take a good head count. But about 12 were left on the island, and their fate was really horrific. So these things happened during war, and it just the Macon raid, though, is talked about, and a lot of people really have heard a lot of different things about it. Hearing Mudhole's version and the things that happened was just fascinating, and I cover all of that in the book.
It's very well covered in the book, as well as the competing versions of what exactly happened during and afterwards. Let's talk about, in our remaining time here, Carole, the two really big parts of the Battle of Guadalcanal that the Marine Raiders were part of. There's Bloody Ridge, and then there's the Long Patrol. Let's start with the look at Bloody Ridge. And you talk about the intensity of fighting in a lot of these different engagements, but I just want to recount one quick paragraph here. You say the attack was furious and vicious, a sudden flash of thousands of rounds of artillery, tracer shells arching through the dark of night, the crash of mortars, screams of men in anger and agony. The attack was almost constant, like rain that subsides for a moment and then pours harder. But the raiders and their courageous counterparts did not intend to move back anymore. And so this was part of kind of an operation of a planned, a coordinated withdrawal to basically pinch the Japanese as they were advancing, and led to a tremendous number of casualties. But the ridge was held. Talk about the intensity and what it was like to fight in that environment.
Well, I'll tell you, the ridge was just that. It was a very high, flat area that ran right up to Henderson Field. That's why it was so critical. And General Vandegrift again calls on Edson and Edson's raiders to defend it. And they knew that the Japanese had fortified themselves, had brought in thousands of more troops. The Japanese were intent on taking Henderson Field back. We had it. They wanted it back. And Vandegrift told Edson, he said, if they get and retake us, he said, we will become another battalion. So Edson had his marching orders, and it was do or die. That battle occurred September 12th and 13th, about a 36 to 38 hour battle. At the height of it, Edson took his raiders and created a horseshoe-shaped line at the top of that ridge, not far from command post headquarters of Vandegrift and not far from the perimeter of Henderson Field. The raiders, some say, were outnumbered 3-1. Some, I've even seen one estimate that says 5-1. And that night, the raiders just, at one point, when that horseshoe began to sort of compress with Japanese all the way around the horseshoe, raiders were actually fighting hand-to-hand combat, back to back with one another, and Japanese in front of them all the way around that horseshoe. But with their fire discipline, with their incredible, just gutsy knife handling ability, hand-to-hand combat ability, just sheer guts, really. Finally, in the wee hours of the morning, Edson was able to radio to Vandegrift to say a simple message: we can hold the line. And it was just one of those incredible defeats. The men were exhausted, and the Japanese, though, knew they were licked. And at that time, they also were able to get some air cover for the retreating Japanese. So the Japanese were really decimated all the way around during that encounter. What an unbelievable story that was. You know, one of the young men that I write about that was a machine gunist, he's on the cover, by the way, of the book. He's the one that's actually stretched out behind the machine gun. And we know approximately where he had his machine gun during that battle on top of that ridge. But Lee Manier also had something else. He had an incredible baritone voice, and he was known, the other raiders knew him through a singing group that he had formed. And after that battle, several of the young men in the raiders, they were exhausted, death all around them, and they asked Lee if he would sing to them some hymns. And he did. It's an incredible scene and an incredible part of the end of that battle that has never been recorded before.
You mentioned the hymns. Faith becomes a very big part of this for at least a couple of the raiders. Mynheer is one of them. Ed, the Swede Blomberg, who is in the 4th Raiders, not part of this particular battle, man of deep faith, still living, in fact. And I believe it was true for at least to some extent the others as well. Talk about that briefly.
Lee Mynheer went over there, and he was a fine young man and had attended church, but there was a chaplain, a Catholic chaplain, that accompanied 1st Raider Battalion, and he was evidently quite an interesting person and quite a committed person himself. And Lee Mynheer had not been there very long on Guadalcanal. They had already come through Tulagi and different things, and he did join the Catholic Church there through the influence of this particular father, chaplain that was with the men. And here's what Lee Mynheer said. He said, you need God out here. That's a direct quote from a letter that he sent home to his mother, that we have that letter. It's an amazing thing. I've even got a photo in the book that I found. I had not seen it published previously. It's in Marine Archives, though. And it's of the men attending Mass. Lee attended Mass every morning at 6. And it's of a huge number of young men kneeling and praying before a battle. So yes, you had that. To some extent, you even see it with Kenny. He grew up knowing the Bible and knowing God, but had not really thought about it very much. But you see, even Kenny sometimes occasionally says, Lord, help me live through this. And then, of course, Colonel Archie Rackerby, also very strong, committed, quieter, I think, with his faith, but committed Christian nonetheless. And then, of course, you mentioned Ed Blomberg, who's still living. And his question was, when he came home, why was I allowed to live? I have found that many, many men come back from war that I've interviewed, and they question that. Why? There's almost like a guilt about it, having left so many of their friends on the battlefield. And we tell the story of Ed and what happens to him. Long story short, he becomes a missionary for the rest of his life after he returns from war. And went to Belize, was down there for 25, 30 years, built orphanages, churches, preached in Spanish, and just dedicated his life to the rainforest and the tribes that lived in Belize.
Amazing stories. Well, we've talked about the Bloody Ridge. Carole, let's talk about the Long Patrol. And this was more with the 2nd Raider Battalion, and that brings us back to Mudhole Merrill, who was part of that. But days and days on end to find and eliminate pockets of Japanese fighters. So you've got the persistent danger of combat, and then you've got the brutal conditions you mentioned earlier, just of being in the jungle all that time. So talk about the toll that took on him and the other men.
They started the Long Patrol in an area called Aola Bay, sort of around that area. It's really kind of southwest of where Henderson Field was. And before they started, Carlson called one of his gung-ho meetings, and he told them that Henderson Field actually was only about 25, 30 miles away from where they were right then, from where they started. And Carlson added, as the crow flies, well, one of the men popped up and said, one of his 2nd Battalion Raiders popped up and said, but sir, we ain't crows. Because the fact of the matter is, they were on that long patrol for 30, 31 days. And by the time they got back to Henderson Field, they had traveled 150 miles, winding in and out, this serpentine line winding in and out of the jungle. They were led by a man named Zusa, who was a tough character himself. He'd been tortured by the Japanese to tell what all he knew about the Marines landing and all like that, and he didn't give up any information. And he became one of the best guides that the Marines had, and he was on that long patrol. He had carriers that he brought with him, other members of his tribe that helped the long patrol carry their ammo and some food and different things. And they were in unknown territory either, because these areas that they went through back in the jungle, these tribesmen had never been back there either. And they encountered all different kinds of pockets of Japanese, took them out. But they would sometimes go for 3 or 4 days without food. They only had about a couple of days of rations with them when they started out. They thought they were going to be able to get some drops, and they just were not able to locate them once they got back up into those thick canopy jungles. So sometimes they would go 3 or 4 days without food. The raiders wound up after 30 days. I mean, Mudhole said, we've got his own account in there. I mean, they were covered in ringworm size sores. Some of them had them all over their bodies. Leeches, they had malaria, they had beriberi, they were fighting fevers. They were in a mess by the time they finished up the long patrol. And when they finally, though, staggered back into Hendersonville after putting out Pistol Pete, which was a huge cannon that kept giving them the devil, that the Japanese kept firing on Hendersonville with, they actually found it and put it out. As what's left of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, when they start marching into Hendersonville, they squared back their shoulders, and I mean, they threw out their chest, and they started singing the Marine hymn. Well, I'm telling you, the men on the Marines on the base that greeted them back from this long patrol went crazy. They formed lines for them to walk through, clapping, cheering. Somebody yelled out, okay, now sing Onward Christian Soldiers. So the Marine Raiders gathered themselves up and sang that as they marched in. It must have been quite a sight. But most of them required incredible medical treatment when they came back. And Mudhole had been through so much by that time. He had lost a couple of his buddies in a really terrible kinds of ways. And that started him on a journey that pretty much took him years and years and years to get beyond.
Carole, let's stop right there for just a moment. When we come back, we will conclude our discussion of the Marine Raiders and their heroic service to our country in World War II. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Thank you so much for being with us. Our guest today is Carole Engle Avriett. She is a military author. She has written 3 books on military history. The most recent, Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalions. And Carole, as we begin to wrap up our conversation here, let's talk about what happened to the Marine Raiders. After Bloody Ridge, after the Long Patrol, the Marines added 2 more Raider battalions, but it wasn't that much later that the Raiders themselves were eventually disbanded. So what happened?
As the war progressed and they began climbing up, the Marines began climbing up what came to be called the island ladder toward the mainland of Japan, the fighting simply required thousands and thousands more troops, heavier and heavier equipment, greater and greater gun power. And the Raiders were lightly armed, fast-moving commando raiding type troops. And their whole mission, and they've been trained, to get in there very fast, maybe at night, fast moving, secretly, create chaos, create confusion, gather intelligence, kill enemy, and then move back out just as quickly. So as they begin to get to these other islands that are so much heavy, so heavier, fortified, with so many more thousands of Japanese troops, the need for these kind of fast-moving, quick-hitting commando-style units, the Raiders, simply were no longer needed, nor could they function under these fortified, stationary-type targets. So they were disbanded, and the Raiders were folded into other Marine units. That did not keep them, though, from performing at the highest level imaginable. They still continued being awarded medals of honor, medals of valor. And it's just an amazing story. The number of valor awards awarded to Marine Raiders by the end of the war far outranged the percentage number of raiders that there were compared to the total number of those fighting in the South Pacific. It's an amazing story. And you know what else I have found? Of course, Marines have heard about Marine raiders, but even people, my friends, others that I've talked with, historians that know a pretty good bit about World War II, do not know that much about these particular elite forces. It's just amazing. And so I'm hoping that this book will stir people into learning about them, because they are storied and they are legendary.
Most of all, what do you want the reader to take away from this book, other than knowing more about the raiders, whether it's just knowing more about the war, appreciating how much sacrifice went into this? What do you want people to take away after reading this?
Well, you've named some of the things, of course, just the history of it and the appreciation of it. But there is something, and you are well aware of this, doing what you do. We are losing these incredible heroes so rapidly. At the start of my book, 3 of the 4 men that I was writing about were living, 3 of them. So I was the last one to interview these 3 men. 2 of them, when I was penning the very last chapter of the book, passed away. One is still living that you referred to. He's 100 years old. Here's what I would take away. We need to get these stories recorded as quickly as we can. Who am I writing? I'm writing this for all of us, that we can appreciate this and understand what they did. But I am also writing these stories for my grandchildren, so that they can understand the commitment that these young men had for this great country, and the commitment that they had to making sure that this great country remained free.
Amazing coda to an amazing story, and I highly encourage everyone to get a copy of Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalions. We've been speaking with Carole Engle Avriett. Carole, what a great pleasure to have you with us today. Congratulations on the new book, and thank you very much for being with us.
It was my pleasure, Greg. Thank you.
Again, Carole Engle Avriett. The book is Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalions. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles.